So I'm going to be talking about Saint Tikhon and his time specifically in the United States, but we have to begin with some backstory. So we'll start when he was a child. When Saint Tikhon was just a boy, he was exceptionally pious and he was devoted to God. His father was a parish priest, so he's from this kind of in 19th century Russia at this time. You know, it was almost like a priestly caste, right? And so a lot of the sons of priests went into seminary. St. Tikhon went into seminary, which seminary being like high school education, right, to kind of prepare future priests, but it was high school age. His friends at school nicknamed him the Patriarch, and they nicknamed him this even though the Patriarchate of Moscow had been abolished a long time before in 1721. So he was getting this nickname because of his piety in seminary. He was a good student. He ended up the cream of the seminary crop would go into the theological academies, which were kind of a graduate school level essentially. And so he went to the St. Petersburg Theological Academy, one of the leading theological academies in Russia. And so you have these seminary students. A lot of them are coming from clergy families, and they would go on to these elite students at the seminaries go on to the theological academies, and then they go on to higher positions in the church. So these are where you get the bishops, the senior clergy at cathedrals, the church administration. They're all coming out of these theological academies. So if you were, pulled into that world, you're on track to be a major church leader in Russian Orthodoxy. The seminaries were also hotbeds of discontent in those days. The 1905, the later on 1905 revolution, the 1917 revolution, seminaries were major centers of revolutionary activity. I like to point out to people that the most famous product of a Russian seminary in that era was Joseph Stalin. So, it was a mixed bag. You had saints and then you had trouble. Saint Tikhon was beloved by his peers. He was also criticized because he wouldn't participate in disruptive behavior. So protests, things like that, they were very, like I said, they were very kind of politically active young men, and Saint Tikhon wasn't interested in that. Once the students of the academy in St. Petersburg staged a walkout of an important event that involved the Metropolitan of St. Petersburg and the Oberprocurator of the Holy Synod. And a classmate later said this. He said, later, the free press, quote unquote, free press reported that there were a few students at the celebration, that the event that everyone else had walked out on, there were a few students that attended, but they were few and far between, 2 or 3 people. And in their number was the Patriarch, St. Tikhon. But on other occasions, St. Tikhon tried to dissuade his classmates from rebellious activity. When they accused him of being a traitor to the cause of freedom, he responded that, in fact, he was following in their footsteps by exercising his right to act freely by not rebelling. It's not that St. Tikhon didn't see the problems that existed in the seminaries or in church administration. He just chose to behave with a certain dignity and poise and decorum rather than this kind of impetuous rebellion that so many of his classmates were engaging in. One of St. Tikhon's professors, I'm falling behind on my slides here. That's St. Tikhon later on when he's in America. One of St. Tikhon's professors was at the Theological Academy was the future Metropolitan Antony Krapovitsky, who would go on many, many years later to become the founding first hierarch of ROKOR, of the Russian Orthodox Church outside of Russia. So, and they would have their interactions later on as well, but this is when they first met, when the future Metropolitan Antony, who wasn't even a bishop yet, was teaching at the academy, and St. Tikhon was a student. So St. Tikhon graduated from the Theological Academy at 23 years old, but he wasn't immediately ordained. And from ages 23 to 26, he worked as a seminary teacher in his hometown of Pskov. So he's not sort of immediately jumping into the kind of high-rising leadership track. He goes back and he's just kind of a simple seminary teacher, a high school teacher, essentially. And when he was 26 years old, on successive days, he was tonsured a monk, and he was then ordained a deacon and a priest. And the following year, he was transferred from Pskov to Chelm, which is now in Poland, where he was elevated to archimandrite. So now he's moving up the rank. Now, just a little side note here. we sort of have this idea, a lot of people have this idea that, kind of the ideal holy Orthodox bishop spends a long time as a simple monk in a monastery, and then eventually is chosen to become kind of a bishop. And this is actually very unusual. That's a very rare path. St. Tikhon's path is much more common, actually, among saintly bishops, where you have someone like St. Tikhon who never actually lived as a monk in a monastery, but is kind of quickly elevated through the ranks. That's actually been the norm for our bishops who have gone on to become saints in modern history, say in the last couple hundred years. So Chelm today is now in Poland, but for 100 years or so, basically from Napoleon until World War I, it was part of the Russian Empire. And back in the 16th century, so a couple 300 years earlier, the Orthodox of that region had entered into a union with the Pope of Rome. And so this is part of what we refer to as the Unia. And even though Chelm had been under Russian control for many decades at this point, by the time St. Tikhon got there, the city remained majority Catholic and Uniate. So it was like Roman Catholic, Latin Catholic, and then also Uniate Catholic. So very few Orthodox. A lot of St. Tikhon's work there involved helping to bring these Uniates into the fold of Orthodoxy. His Archbishop Flavian, who was so impressed with St. Tikhon that he proposed him to become a bishop even before he had reached the canonical minimum age of 33. So the canons say you need to be 33 to become a bishop. And Archbishop Flavian said Tikhon should be a bishop at 32. And so St. Tikhon was actually elected by the Holy Synod. He was made auxiliary bishop of Lublin at the age of 32. And then he continued to bring more and more Uniates into the church. So less than a year after he'd been a bishop for less than a year, he's now 33, so he's just made it to the canonical minimum to become a bishop. And he is elected bishop for the Diocese of the Aleutian Islands, which in terms of landmass was the largest Orthodox diocese in the world by far. And so at the end of his final liturgy in Chelm, he made a full prostration to the people, asking for their forgiveness. It's an amazing story, actually. So everyone's weeping. He makes this prostration to the people, asks their forgiveness for his sins against them. He gets onto the train to leave, and then dozens of men lay down on the train tracks to try to prevent the train from leaving because they don't want him to leave. And so eventually he convinces them to let him go. But this illustrates how beloved he was. And you see this everywhere he goes. This is kind of the reaction people have to him, is they just love him. So there's something about him that's just warm and makes him beloved. So I want to pull back for a second, though, because he's coming to North America. I need to explain a little bit about the backstory of the Diocese of the Aleutian Islands and this big giant diocese that he's taking over. So up until 1867, Alaska, which was also known as Russian America, was part of the Russian Empire. As many of you know, the Orthodox churches in Alaska were actually part of the Diocese of Kamchatka in Siberia. In 1867, Russia sold Alaska to the United States. And at this moment, the only Orthodox churches in the Western Hemisphere were the churches in Alaska in 1867, and that was it. There were no other churches in the United States had no churches. You just had these handful of churches in Alaska, the Alaskan Mission. And this was the product of 70 plus years of Russian Orthodox missionary work at this point, going back to St. Herman of Alaska and the Kodiak missionaries. The greatest missionary of this Alaskan era was St. Innocent Veniaminov, who 1 month after the sale of Alaska in 1867, St. Innocent, who at that point, so this is St. Innocent as a young man, at that point he's an old man, he was elected Metropolitan of Moscow. St. Innocent, 1 month after the sale of Alaska, becomes Metropolitan of Moscow. And St. Innocent wrote a remarkable letter to the Oberprocurator of the Holy Synod. This was the Tsar's official representative to the Holy Synod. And St. Innocent wrote to the Oberprocurator, and he called for an English-speaking bishop for North America. He called for English language church services, English books, English schools, and to quote him directly, converts to Orthodoxy from among the American citizens. So this great missionary laid out a blueprint for Orthodoxy to, and I'm going to use his words here, penetrate the United States. So this is his vision. So this visionary plan was never fully implemented. It is true that a bishop who did know English, John Mitropolsky, who's pictured here, he was appointed to America, and the diocesan see was actually moved from Alaska, from Sitka, down to San Francisco. So they did a couple of the things that St. Innocent said, but English did not become the norm, and American converts were practically non-existent. For the next 25 years, the diocese added just one single parish in the contiguous United States, and that was the San Francisco Cathedral. So the diocese, it faced one problem after another during those 25 years. There were long stretches, years, where there was no bishop. In 1878, the dean of the cathedral in San Francisco was killed by a blow to the head in the middle of the night outside of a saloon. This was a mystery that was never solved. No one knows who killed this priest. His assistant priest was one of the prime suspects. Soon after this, a new bishop arrived, Bishop Nestor, who was, by all accounts, a very good bishop. But a few years later, he also died. In his case, it was apparently suicide by drowning in a fit of kind of sort of lost his mind due to a condition called neuralgia, terribly painful nerve disorder. So it's very tragic. All these kind of terrible things happening during this period. In 1888, they received a bishop, Bishop Vladimir, who took over, but his tenure was absolutely rocked by scandals. So the cathedral was burned to the ground, possibly due to arson. There were allegations of financial impropriety, and the worst claims were allegations of child abuse by Bishop Vladimir. And I'm not going to go into detail. It's pretty nasty stuff. The San Francisco Cathedral community was deeply divided. In the middle of all of this, in the spring of 1891, a delegation from St. Alexis Thoth's Uniate Parish in Minneapolis arrived in San Francisco, and they were seeking to join the Orthodox Church. So it's remarkable that just as like utter chaos is reigning and scandal, in the San Francisco Cathedral community, you have the great return of the Unia beginning. It's just a remarkable kind of coincidence of events. So finally, in June of 1891, the Russian Holy Synod mercifully recalled Vladimir to America, and his replacement was a really exceptional man. His replacement was Bishop Nicholas Zyorov. Bishop Nicholas had been, he's been almost totally forgotten today, totally overshadowed by St. Tikhon, understandably overshadowed by St. Tikhon. St. Tikhon is such a great bishop. But Nicholas was a great hierarch in his own right, possibly even saintly. I think some attention should probably be given to that at some point by some canonization committees. He laid the foundation on which St. Tikhon built. Bishop Nicholas came to America in 1892, which was the same year Ellis Island opened. And St. Alexis Thoth and the very first Carpatho-Rusins had just converted to Orthodoxy the year before. So you have these two big things happening, the beginning of the return of the Unia and the beginning of the Great Immigration simultaneously. And this Great Immigration through Ellis Island, where thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands of Orthodox Christians coming over from Eastern Europe, from the Mediterranean, and you also have these Eastern Rite Catholics, these Uniates coming into Orthodoxy. So Bishop Nicholas is facing a remarkably complex situation. He still has the natives in Alaska who are dealing with a lot of adversity due to the American rule there. So it's a very complex situation. So Nicholas's work as a missionary bishop was critical in bringing the Uniates into the Orthodox Church. He was handled that very deftly. His missionary vision was not only limited to the Uniates. It was with Bishop Nicholas's blessing that the landmark English translation of the Orthodox Service Book began. This was translated by Isabel Hapgood, who was an Episcopalian Russophile. She never became Orthodox. She worked extensively to promote Orthodoxy to Americans. She never actually became Orthodox herself. Her translation took 11 years to complete, and it was finished under St. Tikhon, but it was started under Bishop Nicholas. So he's the one kind of initiating, in a way, kind of many years later, some of the things that Saint Innocent had been recommending. Um, so Bishop Nicholas, first and foremost, was a spiritual father to his flock. He emphasized the importance of prayer among the laity. He encouraged the laity to pray the Jesus prayer, to read the Psalms. He spoke out against the heterodox. He taught people, the Orthodox people, they can only find salvation in the church, not outside of it. This was a very pressing issue in Alaska, in particular, because the Alaskan Orthodox were victims of U.S. government-sponsored Protestant proselytizing. Bishop Nicholas consistently defended the Orthodox Alaskans here. This included writing a very strong public letter to President William McKinley. In 1895, May of 1895, so only 3 years into his tenure, he's summoned to Russia, and there are rumors swirling that he's going to be replaced only after a few years. But the rumors were false. In fact, he spent the trip there recruiting clergy for North America, and he was wildly successful. This is like the most successful recruiting trip any human being's ever had. Tsar Nicholas II gave Bishop Nicholas his elderly former tutor, a saintly Greek archimandrite named Theoklitos Triantafilides. So this is the former tutor to the Tsar when he was a child. He served at the Tsar's wedding. Father Theoklitos, at this point, he's in his 60s. He would go to Galveston, Texas, and he started a multi-ethnic parish in Galveston, Texas. Bishop Nicholas, he wasn't finished there. He also brought back the young, brilliant Syrian archimandrite Raphael Hawawini, who was living in a kind of exile in Russia after he had challenged the ethnic Greek control of the Antiochian Patriarchate. But that wasn't all, right? So you have a holy Greek priest, you have a holy Antiochian priest that he's recruited over there from Russia. He also gets two new graduates of the St. Petersburg Theological Academy, two young laymen. One of them is Alexander Hotovitsky, and the other is John Kuchorov. They're best friends, students at the St. Petersburg Theological Academy in their early 20s. John Kuchorov was newly married. Alexander hadn't even gotten married yet. In 1895, August of 1895, Bishop Nicholas ordained St. John Kuchorov to the priesthood in St. Petersburg. He would, of course, as some of you may know, he would go on to be the first priest to be martyred during the Bolshevik Revolution. And so he's a canonized saint. Alexander Hotovitsky was not married yet, but he joined Bishop Nicholas's entourage, and he would be assigned as a chanter for the New York Church, which was just getting started, just getting off the ground. Yet another graduate of the St. Petersburg Theological Academy was a 31-year-old widower, a priest named Anatoly Kamensky, who had just been tonsured a monk. And he would go on to eventually become a bishop in Russia. He would go on ultimately to be martyred by the communists, and he's also a canonized saint. So that's 4 canonized saints we've seen, plus Theoklitos Triantafilides, who may well be canonized himself at some point soon. So then we finally have the 21-year-old novice. Bishop Nicholas meets this 21-year-old novice monk at the Kiev Caves Lavra named Theodore Pashkovsky, and he brings him over. Pashkovsky did not go on to become a saint, but he would eventually become a metropolitan in North America, the head of what is now the OCA. All of these men and others were recruited by Bishop Nicholas for North America. Well, I may have jumped the gun on that one, that picture, but you see St. Raphael Hawawini over there on the right. This is later on when he's a bishop with St. Tikhon and another one of the bishops in America. So you have these men, other elite people recruited by Bishop Nicholas for North America. It's kind of mind-boggling. Like I said, 4 of the 6 people I mentioned a minute ago were canonized saints. So you have 3 hieromartyrs plus St. Raphael. Father Theoklitos, another one. Pashkovsky, the novice monk, ended up leaving monasticism. It never became a full monk. And he went on to marry St. Sebastian Dabovich's sister. And then when she died, he would go on to become a bishop and then later a metropolitan. So Bishop Nicholas returned to America in November of 1895 with his new clergymen, and their ship arrived in New York on November 14th. 3 days later, he blessed the new Syrian chapel in New York. And the next week he was in Chicago, where he installed St. John Kochorov as the priest. Then he went to Minneapolis, where St. Alexis Toth was, and had brought in all those had brought in the Uniates just a few years earlier. In addition to the remarkable clergy, go back here. In addition to the remarkable clergy that he brought over, Bishop Nicholas also recognized how exceptional the young San Francisco-born Saint Sebastian was. So at this point, Sebastian Dablovich is a deacon. He was born in San Francisco to Serbian immigrant parents. He had been educated in Russia, came back, became a deacon, and he's serving there. Bishop Nicholas recognizes his skill. He's an exceptionally talented and intelligent and pious young man. And so he elevates him to the priesthood. And then St. Alexander Hodovitsky, who got married, is ordained a priest. Then Bishop Nicholas established a seminary in Minneapolis to train clergy in America. So now the diocese can develop its own clergy internally without having to sort of send them abroad for study or to recruit people only from overseas. He's clearly thinking ahead about the growth of Orthodoxy in America. As far as I know, no one has talked about canonizing Bishop Nicholas except for maybe me. But practically his entire inner circle were saints, and St. Tikhon inherited this team of saints when he came to America. So Bishop Nicholas, somewhat important to be mindful of when we think about St. Tikhon. We should also kind of think about Bishop Nicholas when we think about St. Tikhon's work in America. So St. Tikhon, time for him to come to America, and he traveled across Europe to New York, and then across the United States to San Francisco. And he arrived in December of 1898. Shortly after reaching San Francisco, he wrote to his spiritual father, "In this time, I'm trying to understand things a bit, knowing people and looking at the city in his spiritual attitude. San Francisco is situated on the mountains between the ocean and the Gulf. The city is beautiful and really more quiet than New York, Chicago, and other big cities. The climate is mild, now is greening, something like spring. The Archbishop's house is not big, but it's clean." So you get this kind of sense of him as a person here. The book Glorified in America, which is published by Holy Trinity Publications out of Jordanville, it has a wonderful chapter on the life of St. Tikhon. I think it's my favorite chapter of that book. And here is how that book describes St. Tikhon's arrival in San Francisco. On December 23rd, nearly 2 weeks after his initial disembarkation in America, St. Tikhon arrived in San Francisco, where he was met by the dean of the cathedral, St. Sebastian, and the saintly archimandrite from Texas, Theoklitos of Galveston, and a plethora of representatives from the different ethnic groups within the diocese: Russians, Serbs, Greeks, and Arabs. Father Theoklitos met the bishop at the church entrance, holding a cross, while another cleric sprinkled holy water on him. When St. Tikhon entered the church, his predecessor, Bishop Nicholas, came out of the altar through the royal doors and greeted him, handing him the episcopal staff of St. Innocent of Alaska, the enlightener of the Aleuts. In the greetings which followed, St. Tikhon invited all the priests of the diocese to serve as his advisors, and he encouraged all the laymen and women of the church to fully utilize their talents and gifts as members of the body of Christ. And St. Tikhon, when he's talking to the clergy and the laity, he recalls the original Kodiak missionaries, and he said this. He said, "In accordance with the ineffable mercy of God, those heathen who inhabited the confines of Alaska and the Aleutian Islands were called to Christ's church. They were catechized and illumined with the light of faith in Christ by monks from Valam, who were the first to sow here the seeds of the gospel's good tidings. After them, their holy labors were continued by their successors, the priests and bishops of the Aleutian Islands, notably the archpriest John Veniaminov, the future Metropolitan Innocent of Moscow, and my predecessor, the Right Reverend Nicholas, who was a man mighty in word and deed. By the will of God, I, in my unworthiness, have also been summoned here to apostolic service. And now," he quotes the Lord's words through the prophet Hosea, I will say, to that which was not my people, thou art my people, and I will love her who was not loved. Up until now, we were strangers and did not know one another. But from now on, through the Lord himself, we will become closely united in the mutual affiliation of a bishop to his flock and a flock to its bishop. In the writings of the Holy Fathers, this affiliation is compared to matrimony. The bishop is like a bridegroom to the flock, his bride, and as a husband loves his wife, so that he leaves his father and mother and cleaves to her, allying himself with her and coming to live with her, so a bishop must love his flock. And as a wife obeys her husband, so the flock must obey its bishop. thus understanding the affiliation of a bishop to his flock and being betrothed to the Aleutian flock, I left my beloved homeland, my aged mother, my friends and acquaintances dear to my heart, and set off for a distant land to you, a people whom I had not known, so that henceforth you would become my people and my beloved. From now on, I will direct my thoughts and cares to you and to your benefit. From now on, I will consecrate my strengths and talents to serving you. I come to you with love, brethren. I request that you also receive me with love. My love will be expressed in care and solicitude towards you, in serving you, and your love should manifest itself in obedience to me, in trusting me, and in cooperation with me. He goes on then to speak directly to the clergy. He calls the clergy his closest co-workers. He says, I have come to this country for the first time, knowing little of her, but you have been laboring here for a long time before me. Many of you have been assimilated into her, and others were born in her. I trust that in my impending service, you will render me great assistance through your knowledge of this country and its people, that by your experience, you will become my true co-workers, men of counsel and reason. And then finally, to the laity, he asked for cooperation and collaboration, emphasizing that we are all members of the one body of Christ. So this warmth and humility set the tone for St. Tikhon's ministry in America. The book Glorified in America describes him like this. The immediate reactions to St. Tikhon's presence and personality were overwhelmingly positive. He had none of the characteristics of the typical Russian hierarch. He was not at all pompous, quite the opposite. He was exceedingly humble. He had a pleasant disposition, a simple way of speaking, and an ingenious sense of humor. Even when he had to scold someone or correct certain behaviors, he did so in a delicate way, which did not cause adverse reactions. He showed great interest in the needs of his flock, paying attention to the smallest details and the most minute concerns of their lives. What was even more striking was the fact that he did not simply listen, he also dedicated himself to solving problems in the most effective and timely fashion possible. He had an incredible gift of perceiving the root causes of issues and finding solutions for not only the symptoms, but the underlying cause. This made his entire flock deeply love him, and almost immediately they wholly devoted themselves to his spiritual and pastoral guidance. So unlike a lot of kind of typical 19th century, early 20th century Russian bishops that were almost these sort of aristocratic figures, very far removed from their people in many cases, St. Tikhon is very warm and he's very personable and he's funny and he cares about his people very deeply. And so you get that just constantly, this how warm he is. He could speak French, German, Latin, and Greek in addition to his native Russian, but he didn't study English until he came to America. And he wrote about this. He said, I started to study the English language for the theory, but practically I know still nothing. And without it, it's impossible to give a speech with it and have correct pronunciation. Bishop Nikolai knew a lot of theory, but spoke with difficulty. So he worked very hard to learn English and learn how to enunciate his words correctly and so forth, so he could communicate to all of the people. St. Tikhon was constantly traveling throughout his time in North America, crisscrossing the continent to minister to his scattered flock. Just to give you an example of this, from May 2nd to June 1st, 1899, a month, right? He went from San Francisco to Minneapolis, then Chicago, Cleveland, Buffalo, Wilkes-Barre, Pennsylvania, New York, then down to Texas. And those are just the highlights. I've skipped over a bunch. But there were lots of little towns in between. All that in 1 month. Then he spent a month back in San Francisco, but soon he was off again, stopping in Seattle. Then he went up to Alaska and he toured Alaska until early September. He covered almost 10,000 miles just on the Alaska trip alone. He returned to California, but then he made a trip to New York in the winter. And then in the spring of 1900, he spent 78 days on the road in Alaska. In 1901, he went to Galveston, Texas, then Oklahoma, Chicago, New York, Philadelphia, Bridgeport, Pittsburgh, Cleveland, and then Chicago again, Minneapolis, then up into Canada, then over across Canada to Sitka in Alaska, and then finally down to San Francisco in October. He was not alone in taking on these dizzying travel responsibilities. This was kind of par for the course for some of these, especially some of these more holy kind of figures that were working here. St. Raphael did the same thing. His focus was primarily on the Syrian people. Even married parish priests had large geographic areas of responsibility beyond their local parish. So St. Alexander Hodovitsky, St. John Kochorov, many others traveling widely, even though they had families back home. Part of church ministry in America in those days meant traveling to seek out the lost sheep. In his report to the Holy Synod for 1902, which was completed a year later, St. Tikhon wrote at some length about the relationship between his diocese and the heterodox Americans. He said, by setting up in North America an independent see, what was intended was, among other things, the acquaintance of the heterodox world with the Orthodox Church. How far has this objective been met? What is being done for this? Very little as of yet, he said. He goes on to say that there were some liturgical books, some articles and pamphlets that were written by St. Sebastian, but nothing more. St. Tikhon wrote, there are among our parishioners 20 to 30 Americans, sometimes in mixed marriages. That is all for the time being. But then he said, the possibilities were greater. He wrote, there is, however, an interest among Americans in the Orthodox faith. It is growing all the time. In our churches here, especially in New York, one often sees Americans who very much like our rites and singing and who want to be acquainted with the doctrine of our church in attendance at services. That this interest may not weaken and in fact bear noticeable fruit, we must work further on it so that the Americans may come to know and understand us. The main thing here is language, without which it is difficult for us to move ahead. For example, so that the enthrallment of Americans with our divine services might not be fleeting, but may leave lasting and deep traces on their souls, they must understand them and be able to follow them using English texts. For this, a service book is needed in the English language. Not our usual service, which is already available in English, the Divine Liturgy text, but a special one, what Americans call a prayer book, i.e., a systematic anthology of the liturgical rites in the order and fullness in which they are generally used in our church. Here, all must be provided for with these objectives in mind, to help the foreigner orient himself immediately and follow without difficulty the order of this or that service. Constant references to previous pages must not be allowed, since the foreigner who is unfamiliar with our rites will helplessly throw up his hands when he sees this. In this service book, we must introduce footnotes containing an explanation of the symbolic actions and rites, which is extremely important for the heterodox. Right now, our mission has at its disposal such a service, a translation by an Episcopalian American, Mrs. Hapgood. We are only waiting for the funds to print it. So that's the Hapgood service book we talked about earlier. That's the cover page right there. The Hapgood service book was ultimately published in 1906. St. Tikhon, though, in this earlier report, he's going to continue. We also need the doctrine of our church in English. True, we do have in English the Catechism of Metropolitan Philaret, but this is very little. We need a dogmatic theology, which would set forth the teaching of our church in connection with a comparative survey of the teaching of other confessions, looking at Orthodox compared to the heterodox. We need for our little English language magazine to flourish, spread, and be disseminated. This will happen when it acquires more collaborators. There are few in our mission, but here the professors of the theological academies, the moving forces in theological studies, should help us, so that through our magazine, the English-speaking world might become acquainted with the theological scholarship of the Russian Church. It is hardly necessary to speak of how beneficial and necessary it is for our missionaries here to acquire skill in the English language. He underlined that. They need to acquire skill in the English language in order to preach and conduct the divine services in it. Of course, for those who come here temporarily and are advanced in age, it is difficult to learn English to this degree, but the establishment of a seminary for us here would be a great boon for us. Its students, future missionaries, would easily make themselves understood in English. There was a little theological seminary school kind of in Minneapolis I mentioned before that Bishop Nicholas had established, but St. Tikhon wanted something more ambitious. Furthermore, our mission among the Americans would meet with great success if we had our own orphanages, hospitals, nurses, etc. Other missions have all of this, which gains them sympathy, attracts benefactors, and sometimes bears more tangible fruit than oral propagation. We have none of this here. We do not even speak much of it. A couple years later, in his report looking back on 1904, St. Tikhon wrote about American inquirers into Orthodoxy. He said, during my tour of the diocese, I also had to enter into relations with the heterodox world to provide answers to those who ask about our church, to listen to the opinions of others concerning her, etc. Sometimes here and in Russia, they ask us the question, why are we converting Americans to Orthodoxy? There are individual instances of conversion, but no mass conversions, and we don't yet strive to do this. We do not have the competent people to do this, and more immediate tasks take precedence. With regard to the heterodox world, we still have only a preparatory activity in familiarization of Americans with the Orthodox Church. So he has this missionary mindset, but there are obstacles, and he's trying to kind of like St. Innocent, kind of say, here's the blueprint. Here's what we need to do to address it. St. Tikhon has the ability to do some of this, and he's doing it to the best of his ability. His brother, this is a little known part of his story. His younger brother, Michael, served as his secretary during his time in America. Michael, sorry, the Michael loved visiting Michael and Tikhon. They lived together. They were roommates. So he's rooming with his brother. His brother's his secretary. And the two of them would love to visit Los Gatos, which was a 2-hour train ride from San Francisco. They rented a house there for $15 a month. And St. Tikhon described their little house as comfortable and secluded on the mountains. On Sundays and feast days, I go to serve in San Francisco. So while they're in San Francisco, St. Tikhon's traveling around. Michael's in San Francisco working as the secretary. Michael became infatuated with an Italian opera singer named Tina da Spada. And when Tina da Spada returned to Italy, Michael was devastated and not just figuratively heartbroken, but he was literally heartbroken. So this is from the San Francisco Call newspaper, December 5th, 1902. Wednesday night, he retired early to his apartment at 1715 Powell Street, where the cathedral is located. He was in such a condition of nervous prostration that Dr. Victor G. Vecchi was summoned to attend to him. He administered sedatives and left his patient, apparently resting easily, but the knowledge that Tina da Spada would depart in the morning and that probably he would never see her again gripped his heart until it ceased its beating. When the family went to awake him in the morning, he was dead. So Michael, very young, younger brother of St. Tikhon, dies, according to the story, of a broken heart. One might wonder if the doctor's sedatives had a role in that. He also had a drinking problem. St. Tikhon was in New York when he received this terrible news, and it was understandably, as you might expect, devastating. Here's how he described his brother's death in a letter to his mentor, Bishop Flavian. A heavy mountain fell upon me. Before the day of his death, they had only sent me a telegram which said that he had fallen ill with nerves. So St. Tikhon rushed back to San Francisco to serve the funeral. There, he sent a petition to from there, San Francisco, he sends a petition to the Holy Synod, and he asked for leave to bring his brother's body back to Russia for burial. And he wanted to see his mother, who was elderly and was obviously grieving, as you might imagine. But he made the pretext of his trip, not a fake pretext, was that he wanted to attend the glorification of Saint Seraphim of Sarov, which was about to happen. So the Synod granted his request, and he set off from San Francisco to New York and then on to Russia. On this trip across the country, he consecrated the new church in Chicago, which was built under the oversight of St. John Kochorov. He also received a uniate parish in Mayfield, Pennsylvania, into Orthodoxy. About 6 months after his brother's death, in May of 1903, about 6 months later, he disembarked for Europe. His American flock was worried. There were rumors, just like there had been rumors about Bishop Nicholas years ago. There were rumors now that St. Tikhon was never coming back. He would remain in Russia. This was the last time they would see their beloved bishop. So the people, the lay people, start writing letters and telegrams back to Russia, begging for St. Tikhon to be returned to them. So I should say here, it was common back in those days for Russian bishops to spend only about 5 years or so in a diocese and then be promoted to another. When they do well, they kind of move up the ladder to a more sort of attractive diocese. This had happened to Bishop Nicholas. St. Tikhon fully expected this to happen to him. This was just what was done, but not yet. He wasn't ready for that yet. While he was in Russia, he lobbied the Holy Synod to grant him a vicar bishop for Alaska. And he also proposed that the diocesan see be transferred from San Francisco to New York. So like Bishop Nicholas before him, while he was there, he tried to recruit capable priests to serve in America. And then in January 1904, so about 6-7 months later, he finally returned to the United States to the great relief of his people. So we should talk a bit about the transfer of the diocesan see to New York. Back in 1900, at the behest of St. Tikhon, the name of the diocese was changed from the Diocese of the Aleutians and Alaska, to the Diocese of the Aleutians and North America. So this reflected the shift, 1900, reflected this shift that had taken place with the return of the Uniates, of the Great Immigration, the centers of gravity shifting in the diocese, not just centered on Alaska anymore. And then 1903, thanks to St. Tikhon's lobbying, the Holy Synod approved the consecration of a vicar bishop for Alaska. So now Alaska would have their own bishop. St. Tikhon could concentrate his activity on mostly the United States and a bit in Canada. San Francisco had served as the headquarters of the diocese up until 1905, but at that point, it's transferred to New York at St. Tikhon's instigation. So here's how he reported on it. He said the transfer was made due to the necessity for the diocesan administration to be closer to the parishes. Only 2 or 3 parishes are closer to San Francisco. 15 to 20 are closer to New York. The majority of the Uniate parishes, many of which are striving toward unification with Orthodoxy, are also located in the eastern states. Mail goes to Russia 5 days faster from New York than San Francisco. The need to transfer the cathedra, the see, to New York arose already under Bishop Nicholas in connection with the movement of the Uniates toward joining Orthodoxy, but this encountered 2 difficulties. The diocese did not have any property in New York, and the church was situated in a small rented house, and communications with the Alaskan churches would have been made difficult. Both obstacles were eliminated in recent years. So here, St. Tikhon refers to the consecration, the construction of St. Nicholas Cathedral in New York under the leadership of St. Alexander Hodovitsky, the cathedral dean. And then the Alaskan issue is resolved by the appointment of a vicar bishop for Alaska, Bishop Innocent, who's pictured here with St. Raphael and St. Tikhon. So these 2 developments made it possible to transfer the diocesan see to New York. In the early 1900s, St. Tikhon came up with a plan to organize the Orthodox immigrants of America into formal ethnic vicariates. Each one would be headed up by its own ethnic bishop. And all of these bishops would sit on a common synod, and the head of the synod would be the Russian archbishop. So this is his vision, right? It was a remarkable plan. And in 1904, he set about bringing his plan to fruition when he consecrated St. Raphael as bishop for the Styrians. The next year, 1905, St. Tikhon published his now famous proposal for America. He wrote, as to the See of North America, it ought to be made into an exarchate of the Russian church. The fact is that this See is composed not only of different nationalities, but also different Orthodox churches. He pointed out that these different churches each have their own peculiarities in canonical structure and liturgical rites, pastoral life, and he said these peculiarities are dear to them and are altogether tolerable from the general Orthodox point of view. He said that these peculiarities should be accommodated and preserved. Because of this, he said that each ethnic group, should have a chance to be governed directly by leaders of the same nationality. Therefore, St. Tikhon wrote, the Syrian church here received a bishop of his own, the Right Reverend Raphael of Brooklyn, who nominally is the second vicar to the Archbishop of the Aleutian Sea, but who in his own field of activity is almost independent. The Serbian parishes are directly subject to a separate leader. He's referring here to St. Sebastian Dabovich, who at present is an archimandrite, but may be consecrated a bishop in the near future. Regarding the Greeks, and there were lots of Greeks in America, they were the largest of all the ethnic groups. St. Tikhon said they have entered into communication with the Synod of Athens on the subject of getting a bishop for America. This did not actually end up happening. And the Greeks, for the most part, with very few exceptions, were independent of the Russian diocese. St. Tikhon went on to say, in short, it is possible that there will be formed in America an entire exarchate of national Orthodox churches with their own bishops, whose exarch is to be the Russian archbishop. In his own field of work, each of these bishops is to be independent, but the affairs that concern the American church in general are to be decided by a general council, presided over by the Russian archbishop. Through him will be preserved the connection of the Orthodox Church of America with the Church of Russia, and a degree of dependence of the former on the latter. Also, we must keep in view that compared with life in the old country, America has its peculiarities with which the local Orthodox Church is obliged to count, and that consequently it ought to be allowed to be more autonomous than other metropolitan districts in America. And in the original Russian, St. Tikhon actually put the word autocephaly with a question mark in parentheses. So he's clearly thinking several steps down the road here. His proposal and the reality of his time in America kind of cut 2 ways. So on the one hand, it's clear that the old myth that you'll sometimes hear even today, that all Orthodox of America were united under the Russian church until 1917, that myth is not accurate. On the other hand, St. Tikhon's vision for Orthodoxy in America calls us to something greater than we have even now. He envisioned a unified church in America that at the same time preserved the diversity of different Orthodox cultures and ministered to the specific pastoral needs of various immigrant groups. This is very pragmatic. He's a very pragmatic bishop. St. Tikhon was based out of New York only for a couple of years before he was elected Metropolitan of Yaroslavl. And his replacement, Archbishop Platon, was a very different man, stern rather than warm. Just before his departure, St. Tikhon oversaw the first All-American Sobor in Pennsylvania, which was a clergy laity assembly that presaged the future All-Russian Sobor of 1917. Of course, St. Tikhon played a major role in that. It would elect him patriarch. Clergy from all over the archdiocese came to this meeting, this All-American Sobor, and St. Tikhon was able to have a final meal with them, and he gave a poignant speech. I'm going to read from this speech because it's so kind of evocative of who he was as a bishop in America. This is the Sobor. He said, "Fathers and brothers, this is our farewell meal, but the sorrow of my parting with my flock is tempered by the fact that I have the possibility today of seeing almost all of my colleagues in the States. And so I take the opportunity of this gathering to express to you my thanks for our work together. We labored and toiled together. In some matters, I took the initiative from you and inspired you, and you did the work, realizing my ideas. I took the initiative for you," he said. And you did the work, realizing my ideas. Conversely, in other cases, you gave me ideas, and I am not ashamed to admit it. Then I sought the means and possibility to realize your idea practically. I appealed to you to work together from the very beginning. In my first speech in the San Francisco Cathedral, and my words were not in vain. If anything has been done here, it has not been done by me alone, but together with you. It is evident that the Lord God helped us. More than once, I have told you that the more I study the history of the Orthodox Church in this country, the more I am convinced that our work here is God's work, that God himself is helping us, that when it seems as though everything we do is ready to fail, the work of Russian Orthodoxy, on the contrary, it not only does not die, but it grows in new strength and brilliance. I recall how strongly I was disturbed by the news of my appointment to America. I was not saddened so much by leaving the flock in Chelm, whom I had gotten used to, and where it seemed I was of some use. I was sorrowful, not so much at the thought of having to go to a country distant and of leaving my very old ailing mother at home, as I was depressed when I realized that I was little suited for this work for which I was being sent, and little acquainted with it. And what happened? Who else but God? He helped me spend over 8 years here in service, which not only gained praise from people, but was somewhat useful for our work here itself. And now I am inclined to think that even my appointment to America occurred not so much by human judgment as by God's design, that it was well timed for the flock here. From the beginning, I gave my colleagues wide room for initiative. As long as the work got done, it was not important to me whether it began with me or others. And the consequences of this were not slow in being told. Parishes began to multiply, new churches were built, the number of parishioners grew, new institutions were established. On the other side, they cannot reproach me for lack of firmness or patience. On the contrary, when others thought it necessary, for example, to abandon some project or take some stringent measures to suspend someone, I always took my leave humbly and patiently, preferring to wait it out, fearing that I might extinguish smoking flax and shatter a broken reed. And who knows how many people and projects have thus been preserved. But then, so he sounds like he's kind of boasting, right? But then he says, I should not boast. Better I turn to my weaknesses. And then he it is this startlingly self-reflective manner and gives a kind of confession. He said, yes, he had given the clergy wide latitude, but perhaps he had gone too far in this. Does my patience not sometimes pass over into connivance? He asked. Or was his well-known patience, did it spill over into apathy, he said, to complete indifference or stony insensitivity? So he's there's sort of, yes, I have strengths, but those strengths can become flaws if kind of if they go too far. He spent half a dozen years in his new see and then became Archbishop of Vilnius in modern Lithuania. His American experience and his experience in Chelm was particularly valuable in Vilnius because the new diocese was mostly populated by the heterodox, including many unions. And then in July of 1917, in between the February and the October revolutions, he was elected Metropolitan of Moscow. And a few months later, he was elected Patriarch. We know the rest. Of course, his leadership of the Russian Church through the worst persecution since Diocletian, his self-emptying service, his defense of orthodoxy against the heretical living church, his imprisonment, his torture, his death that may well have been murder, but in any case was a form of martyrdom. He is understandably and rightly one of the most beloved saints of the 20th century. I think it's appropriate to close this by quoting St. Tikhon's homily at his final Divine Liturgy in America, which was the Sunday of Orthodoxy in 1907. He said this to the people: "It is not enough, brethren, to celebrate the triumph of Orthodoxy. We have to concur in this triumph. And for this, we have to guard sacredly the Orthodox faith, to stand firm in it, disregarding the fact that we live in a non-Orthodox country, not giving heed to opinions one hears, such as, this is not the old country here, this is a free land. Therefore, supposedly, we may not have to observe everything that the church requires, as if the word of God is suitable only for the old country and not for the whole world, as if the Church of Christ is not Catholic, as if the Orthodox faith is not the one that sustains the universe. But guarding the Orthodox faith sacredly and loving it is not enough. Christ the Savior said that lighting the candle, one does not put it under a bushel, but on a candlestick. And the light of orthodoxy is lighted not for a small circle of people. No, the Orthodox Church is Catholic. She remembers the will of her founder. Go into all the world and preach the gospel to every creature, teach all the nations. We ought to share our spiritual wealth, truth, and light with others. Thus, each of us should consider this task of propagating the faith as his own task, dear to his heart. I have spoken of this many times to my flock, and now departing from here, I leave it to you as my last will to cherish and to fulfill. And first of all, you, brethren of this holy temple, testify to your beliefs as Russian people in your cultural traditions. May God strengthen you always in devotion to the Orthodox faith. Farewell to you, America. For some, you are a fatherland. For others, you were a haven that gave them shelter, work, and prosperity. Still others in this free land obtained the right to profess the sound, true faith. In antiquity, God spoke through the prophets, and seek the peace of the city to which I have caused you to be carried, and pray the Lord for it, for in its welfare you shall find your welfare. And we pray likewise for the abundance of the fruits of the earth, for healthful seasons in all our services. So let the blessing of God be with this country and this city and this temple, and may the blessing of God be with all of you now and always and unto ages of ages. Amen. And that is the end of St. Tikhon's ministry in America. And that is also the end of my talk. So I am very happy to receive any questions that anyone has.
So when we speak about Saint Tikhon, we know how he is seen in the United States by the Orthodox community. How is he remembered in Russia, both the Soviet Russia and modern Russia? Is there difference in how he is seen and remembered here in the United States and there in Russia?
It's hard for me to answer because I am an American born. I am grew up Antiochian, so I'm not Russian. I've never been to Russia, so I can't really answer that question exactly. My answer would be based on sort of hearsay, but not based on direct knowledge. Yeah, I
Okay.
mean, obviously he was canonized in 1988. He was well, not obviously. I mean, he was canonized in 1988, right? As part of the millennium, the celebrations of 1,000 years of Russian Orthodoxy. So, he's certainly venerated there. But I don't have direct knowledge of kind of what is the current state of the memory of him is.
Mm-hmm. Okay, yeah, there's a question from Roxanne. Hi, Matthew. Is there an estimation of the number of churches in America and Canada that Saint Tikhon started?
It probably is, but I don't have it off the top of my head. Yeah, when he arrived, there were maybe a couple dozen churches. And so there were churches, several churches every year being started. And you kind of have to like, do you count the ones under St. Raphael? Because there were probably close to 30 churches started under St. Raphael, but St. Tikhon was less involved in any of that. And so yeah, I don't have an exact number, unfortunately.
There were a couple of questions about the language situation, like the services. So back then, were there any parishes where there were actual services in English, and what the situation is now?
We have really good data on this because the United States Census Bureau conducted a census of religious bodies every in 1906, 1916, 1926. Well, in 1906 and 1916, they actually asked questions about language. And so we know from that in 1906, almost 100% of Orthodox churches in America, of any different ethnic group, were doing the liturgy and the services in non-English languages. So in Russian churches, it would be Church Slavonic. In Antiochian or Syrian churches, it would be Arabic, etc. Greek churches are in Greek. 10 years later, 1906, I'm not to 1916. So 19 St. Tikhon leaves. 1906 is when Isabel Hapgood's translation of the service book was published. So now we have a service book available, like with all the different liturgical texts for the variable, so the feast days and things like that. Now it's at least possible for parishes to do the services in English. St. Tikhon left the next year, so he couldn't implement anything at that point. The Archbishop, then Archbishop Platon, not super interested in missionary work to the Americans, wanted to convert the Uniates, didn't care so much about Alaska, didn't care so much about converting Americans. And so there was no movement in the Russian church at that point in America to adopt English. The only Orthodox group that adopted English during this period would have been the Antiochians under St. Raphael Hawawini, because of St. Raphael Hawawini, who had a very strong kind of missionary outlook, and also was trying to keep his young people in the church. And he knew that if the young people couldn't understand Arabic because they grew up in America, they needed a language they could understand. So that was kind of the early period. I think if you had gone, even if you went to, the 1960s, almost everybody was still doing services in non-English languages. There were rare exceptions. 1921, there was a very short-lived, for like a few months, English language Orthodox church in New York under the Russian church, but like lasted a few months. So there are these little weird exceptions, but like the overwhelming majority of especially the Russian churches, are not doing anything in English until the second half of the 20th century. And then it becomes today, I mean, it's very normal, very common. There's diversity of practices. So like in the Russian Orthodox Church outside of Russia, in America, ROCOR, which obviously is, where the Holy Trinity Seminary and Monastery and all of that is part of, you'll have all English, services where like almost everything's in English. You'll have services where almost everything's in Church Slavonic, and you'll have mixes, and it just depends on the makeup of the parish and the abilities of the priest.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much. There is a question from Father Daniel. Can you expand on the transition from Bishop Nicholas to Saint Tikhon? He handed him the staff from Saint Innocent. Did he spend much time catching him up on the diocese? Is there any record on what they discussed?
I think it would have been a matter of days that they would have had together to kind of confer with each other. Um, and then the only record we would have would be in some of St. Tikhon's letters. And I could look, but I quoted a little bit, but there's more to those letters, and not all of that's been published in English. There's I think the place to look, and I see there's a question in here that references it. Scott Kenworthy, Professor Scott Kenworthy, has a book coming out later this year on St. Tikhon, and
Mhm.
it will instantly be the definitive work on St. Tikhon. And so I would expect that if there's anything interesting there, it's going to be covered in Scott's book. Scott, not me. Scott Kenworthy is the St. Tikhon expert, right? Like I hope I did a nice job for you guys, but Scott is really like the subject matter expert on this. So he would have anything that exists.
Yeah, good that we covered both questions because yes, it seems like there is a major book coming out soon on Saint Tikhon. So,
And I
um,
think you can pre-order it. I would definitely encourage you, if you look up, I think it's called The People's Patriarch. I would definitely encourage everybody who's interested in St. Tikhon to get a copy of that book when it comes out. Fun anecdote while you're looking up a question, I could tell you St. Tikhon liked to he attended American Thanksgiving when he was here. And he loved to refer to it as Turkey Day. Even later on, like he's Patriarch of Moscow, and he gave an interview to an American journalist, and he talked about, oh, I love your Turkey Day that you guys have. I thought that was, you
yeah.
get a sense of his personality.
Do you have any information or insights regarding St. Tikhon's friendship with the Anglican Episcopal clergy in San Francisco or anywhere else, I would say?
Yeah, yeah. So he had a very, I didn't talk about it, I didn't have enough time to talk about the Anglican stuff, but he had a very close relationship with the Anglican Bishop of Fond du Lac, Wisconsin, who was, you think, what's Fond du Lac, Wisconsin? But he was a very prominent Anglican bishop named Charles Grafton. And they, so at the time, the Anglicans were much like nowadays, people talk about like Orthodoxy and Roman Catholicism and could they, rapprochement and all this stuff. But in those days, Orthodoxy had a very distant relationship with Roman Catholicism, very kind of negative, but very warm relationship with the Anglicans, because the Anglicans hadn't kind of introduced a lot of the innovations that they introduced later on. And there was sort of a party within the Anglican Church that was very pro-Orthodox, they're called Anglo-Catholics, and they were very friendly to the Orthodox. So Saint Tikhon was interacting with these people, like a lot of leading Orthodox figures of that era. Saint Philaret of Moscow had met with them. They were, these guys became friends, right? Saint Tikhon and Bishop Charles Grafton. Um, Saint Tikhon, there was a bit of a falling out that happened between Tikhon and Grafton, Bishop Grafton, in 1905, because in 1905, Saint Tikhon ordained to the priesthood a former Anglican priest who had been defrocked by the Anglicans and then St. Tikhon sort of looked into the matter. The guy wanted to become Orthodox. St. Tikhon received him into the Orthodox Church by chrismation, and then he ordained him to the priesthood. And the Anglicans were very upset about this because they said, we thought we were friends, right? They had just given him this big honor, like an honorary doctorate from their big school. And like, they were very upset. Like, how could you do this to us? And they objected, like their objections were like, you're invading our canonical territory was one of them. You're repudiating our holy orders by reordaining this person, reordaining. But from Saint Tikhon said, first of all, we don't recognize America as your canonical territory. You're not Orthodox, and we don't recognize your priesthood. Like, and so it became this he was very sad about this because he loved them personally. But there was this kind of falling out that happened after that incident in 1905. He gave back his honorary doctorate. In San Francisco, specifically to that question, I don't remember every detail, but there is a church in San Francisco that has a chalice that Saint Tikhon gave them as a gift, and they still like have it out and they like venerate it, I guess. So I know a guy in San Francisco who has all the details, but yeah, he did like give gifts to the Anglicans. Even in San Francisco, there were these positive relationships and stuff. On a personal level, he seemed to really like them. So yeah, I don't know
Yeah,
if that answers it.
yeah, when we talk about modern America, what are the most common ways for people to get converted into Orthodoxy? How do people become Orthodox? We're not talking about people who actually immigrate from Russia or, I don't know, Greece. So, other missions, what are the current activities here?
Yeah,
Speak on that as our last thing to discuss.
sure. Sure, absolutely. Yeah. In America, we now have, I think, around 2,000 Orthodox parishes in the United States of different jurisdictions, different kind of ethnic backgrounds. A very, very sizable percentage of Orthodox Christians are converts to Orthodoxy. I believe the number's somewhere around 30% or so of Orthodox Christians in America are converts. And Orthodoxy in America, some jurisdictions are majority convert clergy or even majority convert laity. It depends on the jurisdiction. Some are much more kind of ethnic emphasis. Some have less of an ethnic emphasis. And so there are parishes in particularly, I would say, in the Antiochian Archdiocese, in the Orthodox Church in America, the OCA, and in the Russian Orthodox Church outside of Russia, ROKOR. You have quite a lot of conversions coming through those jurisdictions in particular. You'll have a lot of convert clergy, and the best way for someone to become, the normative way for someone to become Orthodox is to go visit a parish, to start attending that parish, to get to know the priest, the community, to start taking catechism classes, to build relationships in the community, go to as many services as you can. And usually a normal catechism process, eventually a person will say, I would like to become Orthodox. They will be made a catechumen. And that is kind of there's a service to make a person a catechumen. And now they're being prepared to become an Orthodox Christian. And that process should last a year or more, typically, a year or more to be trained, kind of prepared. And then the person will be received into the church via baptism and chrismation. Some jurisdictions, depending on your background, may only chrismate you, but it just depends. And so that's the normal process. to become an Orthodox Christian. People are finding out about Orthodoxy now online and kind of coming to intellectual conclusions before they've actually like learned about Orthodoxy. And I think it's fine. That's great that people are finding out about Orthodoxy. I would strongly encourage people to go to a church, get real relationships with Orthodox people, get some icons and start saying some morning and evening prayers, those kinds of things, because that's like how you actually learn about Orthodoxy really is sort of experientially.